Okay, so imagine this. You've got a small project, right? Maybe you just need, I don't know, a few $100 for some gear.
Uh-huh.
You go to one of those big online fundraising sites, set up your page, hit launch,
Yeah, makes sense.
and boom, less than an hour later, it's just gone. Campaign deleted, money refunded, and you're banned permanently.
Wow. That's incredibly fast, especially when you think these platforms are supposed to be, well, open tools for all sorts of things. The speed you mentioned, based on the source we're looking at today, is really something.
Exactly. And that really rapid shutdown, that's what we're digging into today. It's this specific incident involving GoFundMe, and we're basing this on source material provided, mostly an interview excerpt with the person it happened to.
Right. And just to be clear, our aim isn't to sort of retry the case here. It's really to unpack the details as they're presented in this source. Look at the timeline, what GoFundMe supposedly said, what the user said back.
And then maybe zoom out a bit, like the source does, see if this tells us anything bigger about, well, online platforms and how they handle content these days.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. The source brings us to the main person in this story, a woman named Brittany Pettibone, and she went to GoFundMe looking for not a huge amount of money.
That's right. The source is specific. She wanted to raise just $400.
$400. Okay.
Yeah. And the reason, she says in the source, was to get some podcast equipment, basically level up her show. She describes the podcast as being based around traditionalism or, talking about traditional values.
Okay, so clear goal, small target, link to her content. But the source really emphasizes how incredibly quickly everything went south after she launched it.
It's pretty wild. The source lays it out. She launches the campaign. Then, just 26 minutes later, someone finds it.
26 minutes.
26 minutes. And the source names this person as Judd Loom, described as the editor-in-chief for Think Progress at the time.
And what did he reportedly do? Just find it or?
No, he apparently tweeted directly at GoFundMe. The source says he claimed Brittany Pettibone, and he apparently called her a conspiracy theorist and white nationalist in the tweet was violating their terms of service.
Whoa. So a very public call out straight to the platform using some really strong labels.
Well,
How fast did GoFundMe act on that, according to the source?
almost instantly. The source states it was about an hour total from the campaign launch. So, maybe 30, 35 minutes after that tweet went out, GoFundMe just deleted the campaign.
Deleted it entirely.
Yep. Refunded any money that had come in and gave her a permanent ban from the platform.
That sequence is just launch, public flag with heavy labels, delete, permanent ban, all inside an hour. Did GoFundMe give a reason? The source mentions a spokesperson.
It does. Yeah, a GoFundMe spokesperson named Bobby Whitmore is quoted in the source. He apparently said the campaign broke their terms of service about hate speech and discrimination.
Hate speech and discrimination.
And according to the source, the spokesperson kind of linked that violation to her description of the podcast covering traditional values.
So the official line, based on the source, is a TOS violation for hate speech connected to the podcast theme. How does Brittany Pettibone respond to that charge in the interview piece?
Well, she pushes back directly.
Yeah.
She explicitly denies trying to discriminate. She says, her podcast actually has guests from different races, different ideologies, specifically mentioning people from all across the right.
So her argument, as the source presents it, is that the content itself wasn't discriminatory.
Exactly. That's her counter.
The source also talks about those labels that got thrown around immediately, white nationalists, etc.
It does, yeah. She mentions being called alt-right and white nationalist. And the source suggests that maybe this came partly because she'd appeared on other podcasts that were described as alt-right-like.
Right, the guilt by association thing. And the source makes a specific point against that, doesn't it?
It does. It uses an analogy, basically arguing that just because you go on someone's show doesn't mean you agree with everything they believe. The example given is something like, if I ever go on CNN, then I support Hillary.
Right, trying to show that kind of linkage is flawed, or at least unfair in her view.
Yeah. And she also mentions, according to the source, being called a Nazi.
So some really extreme labels being applied very quickly. The source also floats another possible reason why she might have been targeted so fast.
Yes, there's speculation in the source that maybe her politics, specifically that she supported Donald Trump, could have played a role in why her campaign got shut down so abruptly.
And what about media coverage? Did the source touch on that?
Briefly, it mentions she apparently turned down some interviews with mainstream outlets because she felt they wouldn't be fair. She specifically called an Associated Press piece a potential hit piece.
Okay.
And it also notes how quickly an article about it appeared in The Observer, like an hour after the campaign was deleted. The source kind of presents that timing as part of the whole rapid sequence.
Okay, so that's the core incident. But here's where it gets really interesting, right? The source uses this whole episode as a jumping off point to talk about bigger issues with these online platforms.
Exactly. And it's interesting because the interviewer in the source actually mentions having used GoFundMe successfully themselves in the past for grassroots stuff. Acknowledging it can be valuable.
Which probably makes this kind of sudden ban feel even more jarring, I imagine.
You'd think so. And the source makes this kind of interesting side point. GoFundMe takes a cut, right? Like 10–15%, it says. So by shutting down campaigns, they're technically cutting their own funding.
Huh. So it's presented as them prioritizing enforcing certain rules over maximizing their own revenue, in a way.
That's the angle the source takes, yeah. Like it's a conscious choice based on something other than just money.
Does the source bring up other examples of platform issues or perceived biases?
There's a quick mention, sort of uncertain, about maybe a cat cafe lady on GoFundMe. But more pointedly, the source contrasts Brittany Pettibone's situation with what it calls political movements from the left that are supposedly on GoFundMe.
Ah, yeah.
Describing those as completely politicized, especially compared to her campaign about traditional values.
And it doesn't just stick to GoFundMe, right? There's an example involving PayPal, too.
Yes, exactly. The source talks about experiences someone named David Seaman, described as former journalist, had with PayPal. It says PayPal kept freezing his funds.
Freezing his funds?
Yeah, he'd have to call them up to get the money released, apparently. And the source links this trouble directly to his research into something it calls Pizzagate, framing it as PayPal reacting to content they don't like.
And just so we're clear, why was PayPal involved there, according to the source?
The source explains it was because people were donating money straight into his PayPal account. So PayPal's actions directly impacted his ability to access those funds.
Right, okay. What's fascinating here, then, is how the source weaves these different examples together to make a bigger argument about platform power.
Yeah, this is the crux of the broader point. The source basically says, look at companies like PayPal, GoFundMe, Google, Facebook. They're dominant. They're leaders, maybe even monopolies, in their digital spaces.
And the argument presented in the source is that once they get that big, what happens?
The source claims they start limiting things they don't like. And it argues these aren't decisions based on some clear principle like freedom of speech, but more on their own internal culture, maybe even the CEO's culture.
So it's presented as kind of subjective filtering based on the company's own preferences or ideologies.
That's the view presented in the source, yes. That it becomes about cutting people off that we don't like to try and, suppress their ideas. The source is quite direct, saying it's not about debate. And it adds that trying to debate these platform decisions often leads to, in the source's words, the same story backed with no evidence.
And this whole idea of centralized power, like big companies owning multiple platforms, Google owning YouTube, for instance, that's a major concern raised too.
Absolutely. The source calls it this consortium of power, using Alphabet owning Google and YouTube as the prime example. And the worry expressed is that this concentration gets so big they can control everything: hiring, access, censorship.
That sounds like a massive amount of potential influence over who gets heard online.
It does. And the source points to the danger as, the world gets more digital. It suggests these platforms could use blanket algorithms or blanket censorship movements to basically silence whole groups of people.
So the GoFundMe incident with Brittany Pettibone is positioned in the source as just one example of this much bigger concerning dynamic.
Yes, exactly. The source explicitly uses her ban as an illustration of this wider trend, linking it to other alleged censorship stories involving different people, mentioning things like ad roll and Google issues discussed elsewhere.
How did Brittany Pettibone herself react? What did she say it felt like, according to the source?
Well, she says pretty clearly in the source that she felt deliberately targeted, specifically because of her political views. She describes it feeling very personal.
Right.
And she also expressed surprise about the person, Judd Loom, who flagged her campaign. Said she hadn't even heard of him before this whole thing.
So given these problems on the big platforms, what does the source say about, building alternatives? Is that feasible?
The source touches on that. It acknowledges that, yes, some people who feel censored want to build their own platforms, alternatives to GoFundMe, whatever. But it immediately highlights a huge hurdle.
Which is?
The source claims that the very people trying to build these alternatives are getting hit with those same labels: Nazis, white supremacists, white nationalists, and the source insists these labels are being used without any evidence.
And the worry is those labels then create practical problems.
Exactly. The source asks, if you're labeled a Nazi, what banks are going to want to work with you?
Yeah.
It makes building the infrastructure incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
So the conclusion in the source is that creating these alternatives will take a really long time because, as it puts it, they have no support from their side, implying the side applying the labels isn't being objective in any way.
But despite all this, the source does indicate that Brittany Pettibone is still active, right? She wasn't totally silenced.
That's right. It notes she's still going. Beverly has a decent Twitter following, over 50,000. So the source says she hasn't been completely stopped, maybe just stymied for the moment.
Stymied for the moment, okay.
Yeah. Her podcast continues. It's on Sound and YouTube, channel named Brittany Pettibone. The source even mentions guests like Tommy Robinson and Lauren Southern. And she's supposedly working on a second book with her sister called Verdict Day.
Okay. And finally, what's the sort of overarching takeaway or perspective the source offers on why these kinds of things might be happening across different platforms?
The view put forward is that these actions, the alleged censorship faced by various people, aren't random. They're seen as all coordinated.
Coordinated. For what purpose?
To create a chilling effect, according to the source. It initially connects this coordination to supporting Trump, but then says it's actually bigger than that, beyond Trump. The source frames the goal as wanting to, red pill world, basically, wanting to fundamentally change people's perspectives.
Okay, so wrapping this up, based just on the source material we've gone through today, we've looked at this really specific rapid shutdown on GoFundMe. We've heard the platform's stated reason versus the user's perspective and her feeling of being targeted.
Right. And we've touched on related examples from PayPal, and then the source's much broader concerns about, platform monopolies, how they make content decisions based on their own culture, apparently.
And the real difficulties faced by people trying to create alternatives when they get hit with these extreme labels, according to the source.
Yeah, the picture the source paints is one where using these essential online tools could depend on navigating very subjective rules and avoiding labels that can trigger really fast, harsh consequences, whatever your actual intent might be.
So this source material we've explored today, it really presents a specific story about powerful online platforms making these quick, consequential decisions. And it definitely leaves you with some big questions, doesn't it? What does an incident like this, as described here, make you think about free expression when private companies control the space? What about access to these tools for different kinds of projects or voices? And ultimately, who gets to draw the lines about what's acceptable in our digital world? Definitely something to think about.